to be able to share in God the Father's love and care for his people has been just the supreme joy of my life.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Continuing the Call, a seminary dropout's guide to discernment. Today I'm joined by Father Michael Niemczak. Father Niemczak is a priest of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, New Mexico, but is currently serving as the Coordinator of the Propaedeutic Formation at Mount Angel Seminary in Oregon. Propaedeutic year of formation is the initial stage of formation that men go through on their journey towards the priesthood. In this conversation, Father Niemczak breaks down those initial questions that go on in discernment, how he helps young men discern whether God is really calling them, and ultimately, where the root of all vocations lie. As you listen to this conversation, I ask that you please say a prayer for Father Niemczak and for all the young men discerning the priesthood. As always, I ask that you share this conversation with anyone who might find it insightful or interesting, and say a prayer for its continued success so that we can keep having awesome conversations like this one. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Father Michael Niemczak. Well, Father, thanks so much for being here. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone, and then we'll kind of work backwards?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So I'm Father Michael Niemczak. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. I served as vocation director and pastor there, but now I am a formation director at Mount Angel Seminary in Oregon. And here I coordinate the propaedeutic stage, which means that I get to work with the guys in the very first stage of formation. The first year that they spend here is in my program.
Nice. Awesome. So now, are you from New Mexico originally, or did you end up there by way of growing up?
So my parents moved there from Poland, or well, they actually moved to Colorado from Poland. I was born there. We moved around a little bit, but by the time I was 7, we settled in New Mexico. So that's what I consider home, since that's where the majority of my raising happened.
Nice. Fantastic. Now, and then tell us about your priesthood. At what age did you kind of end up thinking, hey, you know what, Father Michael sounds pretty good, and, wanted to wear the collar and all of that? Was it younger, older? How did you kind of find yourself discerning that?
So growing up, I never thought of myself as a priest. It wasn't even something that I rejected. It was just something that didn't even come to mind as a possibility for me. I knew that there were priests, and I thought that's cool, but that's not what I'm going to do, obviously. Um, and then in high school, when I benefited from a really good youth group, we started they started asking that question of not just what do you want to do, but also what do you feel you were made for? What might the Lord be inviting you to? And at that same time, I started increasing my devotion to the Eucharist and daily Mass and adoration. I realized if this is true, like this changes everything. Like this is the most important part of my life now. Around that time, the thought of priesthood first entered in, so early on in high school, and it was an immediate rejection from me. I was like, nope, thanks, but no thanks. I'm glad that we have priests, but that is not going to be the trajectory for me. Um, and God was just so gentle and persistent. He was willing to continue that invitation as I grew in prayer, to trust him more, to realize that he's not trying to trap me in something that will lead to my misery, that anything he invites me to is that which will fulfill me most. And so over the course of high school, I kind of wrestled with it a little bit. And then finally, at the end of high school, made the decision to go to seminary. But even then, it was this kind of, okay, I'll go and I'll check it out. But let's be honest, God, probably not going to happen. And then as the years went by, I realized, actually, I never would have thought that I would desire this, but I really do. And by the end of the kind of long process of seminary, there was nothing I desired more.
Nice. Now, what was the initial kind of pushback from it? Because you mentioned that you're like, you hadn't really thought of it, but then when you initially felt that call, you were like, not me, sort of thing, and no way. What were you saying no to? What was kind of that initial pushback?
Well, I was sitting next to my girlfriend the first time that it
That'll do it.
came to mind, and I was like, God, like clearly I got this going. Spoiler alert, we did not get married. Um, I think there was, for me, it was how little time I had given to imagining myself in that life. It was just very foreign to me, and that was scary. So it wasn't any particular thing about it that I rejected. It was more of just, no, that's not the path that I ever imagined for myself. And I think that's um, the point at which many people are with it. They can't point their finger to the exact thing that they don't like about a potential vocation. They just haven't given themselves time to imagine it, and desire necessitates imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Like you need uh, to imagine yourself doing something if you're ever going to allow your heart to desire it. And I just hadn't given that time to imagine myself as a priest, to even have it as an option. So my default was, no, that's kind of foreign, and I don't want it because it's just scary. I haven't thought of myself as that, but I've thought of myself as a husband and father for what at that point it was 14, 15 years. So it was
Yeah.
like 14, 15 years of imagining something versus 15 seconds of imagining something else, and the 15 seconds lost out. But that's where it
Mm-hmm.
was really good to continue in my prayer, to have it come to mind and say, okay, well, maybe I can see myself living that life.
Yeah. No, I think that's massive. That imagination aspect of it, because I mean, the reality nowadays is most young men discerning the priesthood, and then even more so for women discerning the religious life. You come in contact with one, maybe two priests in like your 15 years in those prime discernment ages, and then yeah, so you have one or two priests, and the odds of them being just like you, being like the person who you could imagine yourself being, are just slim, just by the nature of, we're in a planet with 7 billion people, right? So like, you could love your pastor, you could be like, hey, he's fantastic, he's awesome, but I don't resonate with him, right? We don't have the same interests, we don't have the same hobbies. So for, these young men to, put themselves in those shoes and say like, oh, I could see myself being like that guy, it just doesn't happen. And that's why I love having conversations like this, because, a young man who's, only ever met one of the awesome missionary priests that we have that is serving our church, but just doesn't really see the same way. They make it come across a conversation with someone like yourself, and they're like, "Oh wait, hey, actually, that guy kind of likes the same things I do. He has the same hobbies. Maybe I could be like that." So I think that that's a massive part that I've seen in talking with so many people. Um, Now, in your case, did other people see you as a priest? Did you ever get the kind of, in this, while you were saying no, um, was anyone saying, hey, have you ever thought about being a priest? Because I think you could do good at it. Or was it kind of later on after the formation had taken place?
It, before high school, that wasn't ever anything that was brought up. So as I said, it didn't even enter into my mind. I think if somebody had mentioned it, maybe it would have. Um, but during high school, as I started getting more involved in the youth group and becoming really a leader in that youth group, people would start saying things like that. But what I appreciated is the most influential people for my vocation, some of the priests, my youth minister, my parents, they presented it as, I could see you being a great husband and father or being a great priest.
Mm.
And I'm excited to see which of those the Lord invites you to and you desire. So it wasn't this like, you must do this. I think I would have bucked that a little bit. I would have kind of said, oh, you think that I need to be a priest? Well, great, then I won't be. But instead, there was this affirmation that those same qualities are necessary for both vocations, and they see them, but they can see how priesthood would be worth looking into, because maybe um, that one is one that you don't always see someone who both has an interest in it and could potentially do it and be happy in it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that you bring up that point, because that was actually one of the key things when I was going through my discernment, that I realized looking back on growing up in in my family. We were Catholic, but not particularly devout. Like we'd pray before meals, but there was no family rosary or anything like that. Um, but I remember being little, and the one particular time this comes in my head was I was standing in the kitchen and talking to my dad, and he was like, "Oh, what do you want to be when you grow up and all that?" And we're just kind of talking about that. I was like, "I don't know, police officer, join the army or something like that." He's like, "Yeah, those are all great." He's like, "You could be a cop, you could be in the army, or you could be a priest, or you could be, and like it just like it was always thrown in there with like potential career options. I didn't realize till later on how much of a helpful thing that was, because then when I brought up the fact of, years later of, hey, I think I'm called to this, um, it wasn't something completely foreign. I knew that at least on some level, my parents would be okay with me entertaining the fact because they had brought it up. And that's why, yeah, anytime I'm talking to young men, I throw that in there, right? Of like, hey, whether you're gonna need this later on in life, whether you're a husband or whether you're a priest, because like just the little subtle things start kind of kicking that, like, oh yeah, I guess there are priests that come from somewhere. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah. Now, flash forward to your time in seminary. When did that shift happen? What was the first thing in the priesthood that you fell in love with, that you're like, ah, yes, okay, this is, I think, where I'm supposed to be?
Uh, so that shift started happening before even entering. Um, and I think Mass and confession were two things that I was starting to be on the receiving end more engaged with. I benefited so much from those sacraments and was fascinated by the way that the priest is able to generate life um, in the penitent or in the people that he's serving at the Mass. So I think that was one of the first things that gripped me. But then also seeing, like, as I started to fall in love with the faith, I wanted to be able to explain it to people. I wanted to be able to teach it. I was very excited at the prospect of bringing people to know the Lord. And I did that in the youth group as just one of the student leaders. But there was this thought of, I would love to do this in a way where this is my main function in life. Um, then once I entered seminary, that's when my spiritual life, I think, was able to go to like a deeper level than it ever had been, in part because the first few months were so awful. Like you just, it was a fine seminary, it was a great environment, but leaving home for the first time is tough for anybody. Now, then go from more or less doing what you want at a school that was not particularly demanding to a place where your life is quite structured, and you go from a place where you were maybe big fish in a small pond of like, oh, I'm the Catholic guy, and now all the other guys are also the Catholic guy. um, and through that all and some of the comparisons that happen, I found the chapel as my refuge in this beautiful way of having a more tender devotion to Our Lady, and this budding trust in the Lord that if He's inviting me to be there, it's first and foremost for me to fall in love with Him, and secondarily to find out what I can do for Him. Uh, and I think that's when the biggest shifts occurred, because I realized that it's not about me figuring out my profession. It's about me falling in love with Jesus and trusting that He will work with me no matter where I am, even if I get it wrong. Like that He's not going to abandon me. And that gave me the freedom to say, you know what? I'm open to this. And then I kind of saw the priesthood not just as the things that a priest does, but more of the particular relationship that the priest has to our Lord. Um, and I fell in love with the thought of that.
Hmm. I love it. Now, there's so many pieces there to dive into. But yeah, so I've heard multiple talks you've given on that exact subject, right? And one way you phrased it is that the goal of formation is heaven, not the priesthood. Obviously, right? It's the priesthood, but heaven is the goal. And you kind of expressed that same sentiment there, as far as knowing the Lord first, loving Him, letting Him love you is the first priority, and then your vocation will flourish out of that. And I think that that's kind of where it's helpful to be reminded that the vocation is a gift, right, to us, right? We think it's, hey, I'm gonna do this for, in my case, my wife, and hopefully my kids one day, right? Like, this is my gift to them. when in reality, it's like, okay, well, yes. But at the same time, it's also God's gift to us because it's what's going to make us happy. Do you want to kind of dive into that? I mean, you're the real expert in all this. Dive into that aspect of it, of like falling in love with God first so that he can give us the gift of our vocation and then take it from there.
Yeah, I would say the a vocation or the particular vocation is it's a gift and a trap, right? He's really trying to trick us into committing ourselves to something impossible because priestly ministry is humanly impossible. Um, Being a self-sacrificing spouse is humanly impossible. Being a parent, doing that well is humanly impossible. Like all of these things that we commit ourselves to do, we need God's grace to do well. He's given us natural virtue and made it kind of fitting. He's even made it enjoyable. But there's this way that he's embedded in every vocation, this recognition of our dependence on him, and this kind of joy that we find in realizing I don't have to do this alone. This is your gift to me because it reminds me that deepest truth of my humanity, that I'm utterly dependent on you, but you are more generous than I am dependent. And you're always going to give me what I need to be a good husband, be a good father, be a good priest, be a good mother, be a good religious sister, be a good whatever. Uh, and I think that is helpful to think about for a number of reasons. One of them is we often disqualify ourselves from whatever vocation because we think, well, I'm pretty selfish or I'm this or that. Like every Christian is called to self-sacrifice. And so, like, if you're a spouse or a parent, like that's a very particular kind of self-sacrifice that on your own, yeah, you're not going to have the virtues for to do perfectly, but God will actually supply you with all of the virtues you need and then some over time through many failures. And it's the same in the priesthood, it's the same in the religious life. Um, Thinking of it, first of all, in terms of my relationship with the Lord, takes some of the pressure off of myself to be perfectly qualified ahead of time. And instead to say, you know what, Jesus, I just want to love you. I want to get close enough to you to where I can hear your invitation and develop enough trust in this relationship to where I can say, yeah, I'll follow you here or I'll follow you there. I'll even follow you down this path, knowing that you might take me onto another one and that is exactly how you wrote it up. Sometimes there's this fear of, well, what if I um, go like follow along this path for a while and then realize it's not for me? I think it part of that fear is this thought that we're not supposed to make mistakes, or this thought that somehow that's a mistake. When really, if you're following Jesus, no matter how many times you switch a path, it's not a mistake because he might be saying, you know what? This is the particular way I'm going to love you. Is I'm going to take you from here to there and to this other place, and you're going to learn how to trust me radically in all of this. Yeah, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off when we realize the goal of it all is to be close to Jesus, and he can create that closeness in so many different ways. Uh, and so you don't have to be figuring it out alone.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's, I mean, I say it time and time again, right? Like it's the decision to enter seminary should be the same decision that you make either to get ordained or to leave, right? And by that I mean it's saying yes, right? Like the same yes that brought you into the seminary will lead you to the altar to get ordained, or it will lead you out. But if you're still saying yes, right, then you're in the right spot, right? Like there shouldn't be any no's in that. Obviously, right, there's some nuance to that, but on this kind of surface level, right, it all comes down to that servium, right? Like, and if you trusted God to bring you in, then you have to trust him to bring you out, because it's the same good and loving God, right? Like you have to go back and trust. I had a fantastic spiritual director who'd always make me go back to, reflecting and meditating on the first time I felt called, the first time I felt doubt around it, and like not forgetting kind of the pathway that you've walked, because we get so focused on the future, and we're like, I'm going to go this way, that we forgot that, kind of we've always answer these questions time and time again, right? Like odds are in our life when we come to a crossroads, we've been to an analogous crossroads before, and we've come through it, and we've realized that God is still there, and He's still going to love us and take care of us. But for some reason, when we get to that new fork, we're like, God, you've abandoned me. Why would you do this to me? So yeah, it's difficult. But if the more we remember how good God is, the better. Hopefully, one day we'll get to a crossroads and be like, well, God, I don't need to hesitate, because I know you're going to be good either way. And now, so take me through your work now. So you're working with men who are in the initial stages, right? Like they've signed the paperwork and they said, okay, I'm ready to be a priest. I'm ready to go to seminary. And then they have the whole world of formation before them. Kind of give me what is your philosophy with that? As far as a young man comes to you and says, either they had a dream and they saw themselves, ordained a bishop, or they're like, I don't know, this is for me. You get kind of that whole spectrum. What's your first question to them? What's kind of your, hey, let's start molding this clay. Where do you take it from?
Yeah, so the church is doing something incredibly exciting right now. The greatest shift in priestly formation in the past 500 years, we're living it in some of these new stages that have been introduced. So it used to be that you would enter into seminary and right away you go into college seminary or pre-theology, but essentially you just jump straight into philosophy studies. After philosophy studies, you got theology studies. Now there's this dedicated first stage called the propaedeutic stage, where the whole emphasis is on building a foundation through your spiritual and human formation. So yeah, you still take some classes, at least in the way that we do the program here, but you're not jumping into philosophy yet. The classes are all about helping you to attain self-knowledge, self-awareness, and knowledge of God, and awareness of how He's acting in your life. And I think it's this beautiful shift in the way that we're looking at things, not just as what you need to study and when, but the first stage is propaedeutic or preparatory. The next stage is discipleship. So it's all about your relationship with Jesus and have you committed yourself to follow Him closely. And then after that comes configuration, where you've followed Him, now are you being configured to Christ the high priest? Do you see yourself in this role? And then finally, there's vocational synthesis stage, which is you've been ordained a deacon, you go back to your diocese to learn how to be a cleric in that diocese and to discern with your diocese when you're going to be ordained a priest. So that's kind of the overview of the stages of formation. I get to focus on that first one, which isn't you're already a deacon. It isn't even you're already being configured to Christ the high priest. It's do you know yourself and do you know the Lord? Because all of the rest of it is going to be kind of a waste if you don't allow yourself to be known by the church and known by yourself. If you don't, first of all, build the foundation in your relationship with Jesus, you can know all the philosophy and all the theology in the world, but you're going to have this lingering doubt of, well, why am I a priest? If you're a priest for any reason other than Jesus invited me into it and I trust Him and I love Him, so I want to do it, then your reasons might be insufficient. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I get to focus on that first bit of self-knowledge and knowledge of the Lord. It's kind of like that one moment in the Gospels when Jesus is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee and He sees Peter and Andrew and James and John, and He just locks eyes with them and He says, "Follow me." And they have that moment where they have nets in their hands and they have the decision, do I drop the nets and follow Him, or do I stick to the nets? The way I see it is my stage of formation here, the propaedeutic stage, is that moment extended across 12 months, where the men are able to lock eyes with Jesus, see themselves in His eyes, and finally get to know what their own heart's desires are, what their struggles are, what they bring to the table, their personal history that's brought them to this point, so that they can make that decision to follow Him, either in the stage of discipleship on the way of priestly formation or discipleship in the world, following a different vocation. So the goal of the stage is the same for everyone, that you become, that you learn to embrace your humanity as God does, know who you are, know the Lord intimately, so that you can become a faithful disciple and have a little bit of clarity of, am I going to be a disciple on the path toward priesthood, or am I going to be a disciple in the world pursuing a different vocation?
Yeah. Amen. I love it. I love it. And yeah, as you mentioned, that the exciting time of this, because this is all new. I mean, like the church has done it in, some form or fashion. It's always kind of been underlying, but the fact that they're saying, hey, no, this is what we're going to focus on, and it's going to be concrete, and every man is going to go through this, I think is absolutely essential. And the fact, too, that it's being approached that way of, hey, at the end of this year, the only outcome is discipleship. Now, the particulars, right, of which way, that's going to depend on the discernment of each guy. And of course, those questions continue to be asked. But the fact that, presumably, right, ideally, no man is leaving there without a firm and concrete resolution to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. I think is like that's it. Like that's those are the times when I hear that and say, okay, guys, pack your bags, you're going to seminary, right? Like, because that's like cool. I don't care how you're gonna turn out, right? Like it's gonna be better either way. So with that, what's kind of the difference, right? So if a guy comes to you at the end of those 12 months, and what are some of the signs that they're being called to the priesthood through kind of a specific discipleship through the imitation of Christ as priest, versus, hey, he's called to discipleship, but probably through, Christ as a spouse and as, head of a household? What are kind of the signs that for each one of those?
Mm-hmm. So a big part of it is desire. I think sometimes we've learned to distrust our own desires. I think in a weird way, probably because like some of our superficial desires have maybe led us into sin over the years, or they haven't been fulfilled well, and so we've thought, "Ooh, God's will? That probably means the exact opposite of what I want." And I'm going to be super pious man, and I'm going to just do that. Well, a huge part of this year is journeying with the men, exploring their own hearts and their desires. If there's this deep, deep desire to not be a priest, probably a good chance that they're not called to be a priest. It was not a waste of their time to come here during that year, because they were able to finally plumb the depths of their heart and not just do it in a passing way of, oh, do I feel like it today? But over time, see if there's a pattern that unfolds where every time that they think of priesthood, there's a thought of like, oh, please not me, God. If that's the case, and it's not just you had a bad day, but nope, that's kind of the default for me, then we're able to see that, yeah, it's probably not for them. I mean, it's similar to like if a guy's dating a girl and he's like, I really, really do not want to spend the rest of my life with her, but I should probably propose. I'd be like, whoa, no, please not. Don't do that. Um, Similar in the priesthood. That's on the part of the man and his desires. On the part of the church, we might notice that there are some things that he really needs to work on outside of the seminary. Sometimes it could be a psychological issue that the seminary is just not equipped to handle, that's preventing him from entering into formation. Sometimes that would be something that we would say, yeah, probably, or not probably, definitely, you shouldn't be moving forward when you can't enter into formation. Other times it might be a reluctance that he may have to fully engage in the formation, and then we realize um, we haven't been able to get to know you, and so we can't move forward until you're known. And that might be that it's a capacity that needs to develop, or it could be that it's just not for him. And so part of my job is to be the father of the man, to exercise my spiritual fatherhood there. But it's also this weird way in which I get to be father of the bride for the bride of the church,
Yeah.
and ask some of those tough questions of like, are you willing to lay down your life for this bride? If not, if you're not even letting yourself be known by her, then what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Thankfully, the guys that I've been working with this year have just been phenomenal in wanting to be known by the church and to know themselves and to kind of journey together down that path of ever greater self-knowledge. Um, so I haven't had to have too many of those tough conversations.
That's good. That's good. Now, you mentioned a funny thing, right? Of this kind of role of being, father of the bride. Obviously, you're in this role now where you're working with seminarians, and it's not directly marriage prep, but you have pastoral experience in a parish. If you're called back to that, how is this what you're doing now going to influence marriage prep and how you prep married or engaged couples looking to marriage? Because I imagine it's incredibly similar. What is like the thing now you're looking back on and be like, man, if I sit down with, a young man or a young woman getting ready to be married, like this is the question that I'm going to, make sure that I ask. What's kind of been that shift now of like, outside of priesthood, outside of religious life, marriage probably needs to be asked these questions as well.
Oh, that is a great question. So I think more than anything, it's an attitude shift that I need to realize it's not just preparation, but formation.
Mm.
So it's not just you need to learn these things, but more you need to be formed into this kind of a person. Um, so I think that would shift um, the energy that I put into it. I think I would realize Christians in general are in need of more formation than I think we've been receiving. We've presumed that the families will do that.
Mm.
Families are not able to do that as often, maybe, as we would presume. And it falls on the church now to develop structures that help people in their formation as people, like in a more holistic way than just learn these things or go to this class, but more how can we um, create some structures that almost like make every parish into a seminary for its people. Of like this parish exists to form you as people who can be um, engaged in being priest, prophet, and king in the world. So every husband and father can be a priest of his home. Every um, every wife and mother can be that shining living image of the bride of Christ and our church's mother. To be able to form people to view themselves in that light more than just, I guess we need to like settle finances well and argue okay. Like those are the practical skills are one thing and they're important, but they're not everything. I think it might be good even to develop programs that focus on human, spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral dimensions. Like that doesn't need to be just for the priests. That could, I think those are aspects of every human person that like have ramifications for every single vocation.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. No, even just, I mean, it was wild going through marriage prep, having been through seminary, and just the difference in it. And it was really tough. And luckily, my wife is a saint and puts up with me, kind of griping and getting frustrated about this and, wanting to, do more than the marriage prep because I was like, it was fine. It was great. But I mean, and we did like ours was just online and there's probably other ways that we could have done it and resources we could have used. But the particular marriage prep that we went through was just kind of online and it was okay. But like you said, it was very kind of practical stuff of, hey, don't go to bed mad or things like that. And it's like, well, that's helpful, but I don't feel any more, you know, answering a call, right? Like I feel like, okay, cool. It's kind of taking on a job. Like I'll do my job of husband well. But answering to a vocation isn't really translated well of the sense of like, hey, you're called to something. And when you're called to something, you have to respond accordingly. And that's something that I've noticed with a lot of marriage prep is it's, they almost treat it like magic, right? My wife gets mad at me when I say this, that, nothing magic happens on your wedding day. And of course, it's wonderful and it's beautiful. But I'm still the same dumb kid that I was, 10 minutes ago before I said I do. And if you haven't like prepped and prepared, then that grace is just going to fall on you and you're just kind of that guy. And I imagine you're having similar conversations with the men in formation about, nothing magic happens on your ordination day. Is that something that comes up as far as like, hey, the guy that walks into his ordination is the guy that walks out, sort of thing?
Oh yeah, there's the old adage of as the seminarian, so the priest, and I think that translates into the married vocation too. Like as the boyfriend, so the husband, uh, as the fiance, so the bride, so the wife. Um, there is a sense in which, um, yes, something incredible happens, something brand new is created, right? This priest did not exist before, right? This marriage did not exist before. There's this wonder of grace, but what we teach is that like we have a role to play. We're not just these mindless receptacles of grace. We God wants to participate in this with us, or He wants us to participate in His work of sanctifying us, which is awesome. And if we don't take it seriously, kind of terrifying too, right? That we have a role to play. Um, One question that I wish I had asked more often, that I think when I get back into the parish I will, is why do you why do you think Jesus is inviting you to marry this person? Or how is Jesus asking you to love this person, and to like have it be very specific so that it's not just, oh, I have decided to marry this person, but it's more of, is Jesus the one inviting me to love me through this and to teach me how to love through this? Because it's ultimately not that Jesus is the means to you having a happy marriage. It's your marriage is actually the means to you drawing ever closer to Jesus.
Yep.
And sometimes we have him be the instrument toward the end of marriage, and then we put all this weight on our vocation. It's the same for priesthood. Where like we put this burden on this vocation to completely fulfill us, instead of realizing, no, this vocation is for the sake of me learning to love Jesus that much more. And what's beautiful is that once my shift of focus is uh, onto Jesus, in that way of everything serves my relationship with Him, then actually all of the other things become better, and I'm able to love my wife or my parish or whatever so much better, because that's no longer the end goal. The end goal is Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I remember like that's one of those surprisingly controversial things, and I think it's because you hear it so much in formation and when you're kind of like diving into the theology of the church. The fact that no, it goes God and then your spouse, and you know that I think confuses a lot of people. Even now, my wife and I will say that when we're talking to the kids of, I'll openly say, and she'll openly say, for her it's a lot easier to say, right? Like I love Jesus way more than I love my husband. And like the kids are like, oh no, like it's a diss to me. I was like, no, she should, right? Because the more she loves Jesus, the more she's gonna love me.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I need her to be holy. I need her to be a saint in order to put up with me and you know, give me the love that I need and that I'm craving and that I'm looking for. And same goes with me, right? Like I have to love Jesus more than I love her, um, in order to love the way that she deserves. And I think that that's a statement that like people just don't hear often. Um, and I think it again, it all goes back, right? It's full circle to, as you had mentioned, when you're going through seminary and your advice is, fall in love with Christ first, right? Because in anything else you're doing out of love for Him, and more specifically, His love for you, and you're going to be able to address it in the way that He would. And I think it is so fundamental. So yeah, I'm glad you're approaching it with that perspective. So now, in your work as vocation director and working with you know, men who are in formation, you get pretty good at identifying somebody who might have a vocation. I'm assuming. I'm sure at this point you can kind of spot like, hey, I bet this kid has either thought about it, or if he hasn't, he probably should. What are some signs? What are some questions that you know you look at young men and young women for the religious life side of it, that they should probably start asking, or you know, what's kind of your tell that, you know, hey, I think you'd make a good priest. External signs, right? Obviously, within them you'd address desires and things, but what's kind of your first tell that you're like, I bet that kid's thinking about it?
Mm. It's a good question, because it's one that I know sometimes single Catholic men will be
Yep.
frustrated that like the moment that they go to daily mass,
Yep.
everyone's like, hey, you should be a priest. It's like, no, that's a normal thing that someone
Yeah.
in love with Jesus should try to do if their schedule allows for it, and maybe should build their schedule in such a way that it allows for it.
Yep.
Um, but that would be one of this desire to be with the Lord a little bit more, right? Than maybe uh, not just everyone else in a sense of comparing to others, but more of this sense of I really want to be close to him. I really find this joy in bringing people close to him as well. I think that desire to first do what what the disciples were invited to do, right? Come and see, come be with me. And then what the apostles did, being sent out to bring more to him. That is a frequent sign of, ooh, there seems to be some pastoral charity there. Now, all of the initial signs could point in any direction, because that is exactly what a good husband and father and a good
Yep.
layman should have growing in his heart as he draws closer to Jesus. So there's a sense in which the initial signs are going to be the same. The desire portion's big, that there's at least an openness to it. Um, this potential of, ooh, I can see myself there. It kind of scares me, but I can at least see it. That's huge. This closeness to scripture and this desire to preach it, I think that can be a big tell. Uh, and for women, women religious, that's the one that I think is the most neglected. I mean, obviously, we're talking more about priesthood here, but there, I just see so many women who are like waiting for the perfect guy to show up. Where there's this thought of, um, I want I want to be able to love Jesus with everything, but there's this disconnect of I want to be able to do that, but I very much don't want to be a sister. And there it's like, okay, what is your idea of being a sister and what has formed that idea? Because I think there's a lot of women who are looking for Jesus as their spouse, but they don't realize that that's what they're looking for. And part of it is they've either never seen a sister or they have this idea of what a religious vocation is that doesn't correspond to reality. So for any young man or woman, some of the things that I think could lead to a religious vocation or the priesthood are that um, desire to draw ever closer to Jesus, that thought of, I want to commit my life to something that is greater than myself. And there's this charity of, I want to bring others to Jesus and bring Jesus to others. Um, but as going back to the very beginning with imagination, I think it takes having some experiences that can furnish our mind with some images, those images that lead us to have some kind of an imagination of ourselves in that particular role, and then give it some time
Yep.
for desire to grow. I think sometimes in dating too, people are way too hasty to immediately from the first impression that they get of somebody say, yep, this one's for me, this one's not for me, instead of letting desire grow. There might be this like initial, I don't know, but maybe if you just give it a while, you might see the beauty in this other person. um, I think it's that same way with some of the other vocations too. We might
Mm-hmm.
go on one retreat and say, oh, I asked God if I should be a sister, and he said no. Well, how did he say no? Well, I didn't have an overwhelming desire within the 5 minutes that I gave him. So I'm clearly not called to that. It's like, no, give desire time to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, and with that of not being set in stone either, right? Like I think that's, I mean, like I did that, right. Like so when I discerned out of the seminary, I was planning on going back, right. Like I fully thought I was going back, and it took me and my saintful wife like 6 months of her giving me the space and me telling her time and time again of like, wow, you're awesome, you're incredible, you'd make the best spouse, I love you so much, but I'm called to be a priest. And like I was basing that simply off of the fact that that's just what I thought, and I hadn't taken time to like actually discern it, because I thought that, I had made my mind up and not, consulted God since I had left. And like, it's interesting of that, of like, like you said, we have this image of, hey, this is what a sister does, this is what a priest does, and that's not for me. Little do they know that, hey, when you've met a priest, you've met one priest, right? Like, and you can speak of this even more directly, because in your case, I imagine that going through seminary for the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, you never thought you'd end up in Oregon, right? Of all places, working back in the seminary, right? That's always kind of like the sentence of like, hey, congrats, you just got out of seminary, you're going back, sort of thing. And I think that's so important too, of like, hey, you realize that priesthood doesn't look just one way, right? And there's so many different ways to live that out. So I guess with that, what are some of the ways that priesthood has surprised you, that you're like, that have been blessings, that you're like, I never thought I'd get this experience. I thought I was going to be in a parish, which would have been great, but like, what are some of the things that just surprised you and that you found yourself, thanking Jesus that you're his priest?
Hmm. So I have not accurately anticipated any of my assignments up to this point. I always like, there are some guys that are really great at guessing what their next assignment is. I am not one of those guys, but every one of them has been just phenomenal. Um, Not because it was without difficulties. Like, on the contrary, my first time as pastor, there was like, we had a bankruptcy and kind of worldwide pandemic. I don't know if you had heard of it. And then like kind of sad situation with a former pastor as well. And it was like all of these things externally that could have made that assignment like a very difficult one. But there was this deep sense of, this is exactly where God wants me, and I want to be where he wants me to be. And the people of God just being so wonderful. Um, and that's something too, that if you don't let yourself see the beauty in another person, you won't. And so you can look at a congregation and say, like, well, these are the difficulties. Or you can say, Lord, help me to see them like you see them. And then they are just unspeakably beautiful and wonderful. Um, so I think that's been one of the joys and surprises, is that no matter where he calls me, he's already there. And he's always calling me to himself in every new assignment. And it's a different aspect of his glory that I get to see, doing vocations work, doing parish ministry, here in formation work. There are different aspects of spiritual fatherhood that he's calling me to grow into. Um, and I've just been really enjoying all of it. But I think there's one point about like what we imagine the vocation to be, that it's important uh, from the beginning to just have a certain humility of, I have no idea. Like when the guys here are deciding between, in their minds, they're deciding between marriage and priesthood. Um, they actually don't know if upon leaving seminary they'll ever find a spouse. I need to remind them sometimes, like, you have to convince a woman to marry, right? But then also with that, like, we don't know. Sometimes we say, well, I want to be a dad. Well, we don't know actually if God's going to give that gift. We might say, I want to be a parish priest. Well, it might be that God sends you into the seminary. Um, you might say, I want this kind of a marriage. Well, you don't know if that's the exact kind of marriage that you're going to have. And so that's why we have to go back to the foundation of, is this my way of living out my relationship with Jesus? Because if it is, then I can find joy in any parish, in any assignment. I can find joy in my marriage, even if it isn't exactly the way that I drew it up. I can find a way to still exercise self-sacrificial love, and even the kind of generativity that parents would have, even if God decides to have me express that in a way other than having children. Uh, yeah, just gotta all be founded in that relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you put it, of everywhere God's calling us, it's to himself, right? Like Jesus is, yes, calling us to a particular place and a particular ministry. But beneath all that, he's calling us to himself. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it, because I think that that's the kind of, that gives us the confidence in every vocation, right? To say yes, right? Of, hey, if something is, if you're called to something in your marriage, or whether it's a great difficulty or great joy, both of those have the same end, which is Christ, right? Like, and same with the priesthood. So I love that. Makes sense why you're there talking about vocations and discernment. Um, Last little bit to end. I guess two bits. One, you've said a ton of times everywhere, right? Your name comes up. You say that you love being a priest. So first portion is, why do you love being a priest? Why? What is it? In a couple words, what is it about the priesthood that just fills you with joy?
It has fulfilled my desire to be a dad more than I ever imagined it could have. I often thought in seminary that spiritual fatherhood was kind of this consolation prize. Like, yeah, it's a cute thing that they say. But to be able to share in God the Father's love and care for his people has been just the supreme joy of my life. And yeah, to have a tiny glimpse into the love in his heart for his people, and to realize that by wearing this, I'm saying to anybody that I ever meet, I belong to you, right? Because you're God's. You're God's son or daughter, and sons and daughters can always say to their father, Dad, I need you. And I get to be an extension of his fatherhood to anybody that I meet. And that's a profound honor and such a joy.
Wow. Wow. I love it. I just got goosebumps thinking about it. Because, yeah, you're right. Right. And even down to the fact that everyone calls you father. Everyone you meet, right, calls you father. And that's incredible. So now with that, what's your advice to young men, young women who are kind of in those initial stages and they're like, you know what, they're wrestling with it. Maybe they haven't even told anyone. What's kind of your advice of to give them confidence that, hey, do this, pursue it. And even if you end up not ordained, not professed, it's going to be okay. What's kind of your piece that you always give them to have them pick up the phone and call the vocation director? What's that initial piece of information to just take that first step?
I'd say it's a win-win, right? God's not gonna, he's bigger than all of the options that you have. So it's not, sometimes we look at our vocation on this one track path of like this one thing that I can do that God will be happy with me for. Everything else, he will be mad at me and I will be miserable. But God's bigger than all of the options. So say you follow a particular path for a while and then he invites you to hop onto a different one. None of that time was wasted because he was doing something incredible in you during that time. So I would say the bit of advice is grow so in love with Jesus in your prayer that you can trust him enough to, when you're at the fork and he isn't saying anything, you can just make a decision and follow a path and trust that he's not going to let you fall off a cliff. If there's something that is actually going to lead to your misery, he loves you enough to where he will make it abundantly clear. And if he isn't, then maybe you're going on the right path. Like, you can actually trust that you can make a decision and the Lord will work with you on it.
Well, Father, thank you. I appreciate it. Again, it's so abundantly clear, right, with every answer, every little bit that you explain about discernment and vocation. Makes sense why God's providence works and you are where you are. With that, I don't know. I know you do. You speak different places. I know you post your homilies. Is there anywhere that if anyone's like, hey, this guy, he has it figured out, I want to hear more, is there anywhere they can follow you or that you kind of put your stuff out, or is it just asking for prayers? Where how do you want the people to follow up?
Gotcha. So if you want a guy who's got it all figured out, I would recommend Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. uh, that would be the source for meeting that guy. If you want a guy who is a sinner that God's very merciful toward and who's just trying to figure it out, you can the podcast where I posted my homilies back when I would preach every Sunday was the Father Michael Niemczak podcast. I'm thinking of maybe starting to post some thoughts or homilies on there again. But yeah, there's no like one place. I guess just pray for me. That'd be the bigger thing.
Absolutely. No, you can definitely count on that. Well, Father, thank you again. Again, I can't express the profound wisdom, and as people go back and listen to it, I'm sure they'll find stuff in there. And who knows, somebody listening to it might end up in your propaedeutic formation, say like, "Hey, I listened to a podcast with you, and it got me here," and then it'll be great because then they're your problem, so you can sort it all out. But
great.
thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. God bless you.